The trench line exploded with light before I even gave the signal to advance. Someone on the enemy side had seen us coming, and now the sky over the ridge was full of tracer fire, screaming past our heads in bright red lines. I pressed myself against the cold dirt wall and looked down my row of soldiers. 12 of them, all waiting on my word. I am Sergeant Vorn Katessa, 3rd Legion, and I have led soldiers into worse places than this. But something about that morning felt different before it even began. Maybe it was the fog sitting low over the valley. Maybe it was the silence from command that had lasted 3 days before this order came through. Or maybe it was the newest member of my unit, crouched 2 spaces down from me, checking his rifle with hands that did not shake at all. His name was Marcus Reyes, a human. The only one in my company, placed there as part of some agreement between our high command and the human coalition delegates. I had not asked for him. I had not wanted him. But orders were orders, and so for 6 weeks he had trained beside my soldiers, eaten beside them, slept in the same cold barracks. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He watched more than he talked. I had decided, without much thought, that this made him either very disciplined or very strange. Today I would learn it was neither. It was something else entirely, something I did not yet have a word for. The stronghold ahead of us belonged to a breakaway faction that had been raiding supply convoys for months, killing drivers, burning food meant for refugee camps 2 provinces over. Command wanted it finished, not contained, finished. The message that came down through my comm unit that morning was short, and I had read it out loud to my soldiers before we moved. No mercy. Take the stronghold. Leave nothing behind that can rise again. I had given this exact order many times before in my career. 11 times, if I am honest with the count. Among my people, the phrase has a very old meaning, one that goes back further than any of us can trace. It means what it says plainly. Burn what is wounded. Do not leave enemies breathing who might, one day, pick up a rifle again. It is not born from hatred. It is arithmetic. The fewer of them standing today, the fewer of my own soldiers bleeding tomorrow. That is how the equation has always worked, and no one had ever questioned it in front of me before. I looked at Marcus Reyes when I gave that order. He nodded once, the way a soldier nods when he understands his assignment, and said nothing more. I remember feeling a small flicker of relief. Humans had a reputation among the coalition forces by then, one that had followed them through every joint campaign I had heard reported. Fierce, unpredictable, willing to do things that made softer species turn away. I assumed, in that moment, that he was the one soldier in my column who needed no convincing at all. I was wrong about what he was willing to do. It would take me the rest of that day, and many days after, to understand exactly how wrong I had been, and what the words I had spoken so easily actually meant to him. The signal came. We moved. Advancing under fire is not the chaos that stories make it out to be. It is loud, yes, and there is a kind of pressure in your chest that never leaves once the first round is fired near you. But there is also a strange, narrow focus that takes over. You stop hearing the noise as noise. You start hearing it as information. Which direction? How close? Whether to move or to wait. I heard my soldiers breathing beside me, heard boots hitting wet ground, heard the far-off crack of return fire from our support line covering our approach. Marcus moved differently than the rest of my column. Where my soldiers pushed forward in tight formation, trained since childhood to advance as a single moving wall, he broke pattern almost immediately, cutting left along a low ridge that gave him a better angle on the stronghold's forward post. I opened my mouth to call him back into formation, and then closed it again, because in the 3 seconds it took me to react, he had already ended the threat from that forward post without a single one of my soldiers taking a hit from it. I told myself it was luck. Even skilled soldiers get lucky sometimes. It was not luck. By the time we reached the outer wall of the stronghold, I had watched him do the same thing 4 more times. Not recklessness. Not showing off for the sergeant who doubted him. Something closer to a pattern I did not recognize yet. A kind of quiet, almost mathematical precision. Like a man solving a puzzle that had already been solved in his mind long before his boots ever touched the ground. We breached the outer wall in under 2 minutes. Inside, the fighting narrowed into the tight corridors and rooms of the compound itself, the kind of close combat that costs the most lives on both sides. This was the part of the order that worried me most, the part where no mercy would have to be carried out room by room, soldier by soldier, against people who might already be reaching for a weapon on the ground, rather than raising their hands. I split my column into 2 groups, to clear the compound faster. Marcus ended up in the group without me, moving through the eastern corridor while I took the western side with the rest. I heard the reports come through my comm unit as they happened. Room cleared. Room cleared. No casualties on our side. It was, by every measure I had ever used to judge a mission, going well. Then I heard something that made me stop moving entirely. One of the younger soldiers in the eastern group, a private named Torin, came over the comm with a voice tight enough that I knew something was wrong before he even finished his sentence. He said that Reyes had zip-tied 2 enemy fighters instead of finishing them, that he had checked their wounds and moved them against a wall out of the line of fire, and that he was doing this while the compound was still hot, while there were still shots being exchanged only 2 rooms away. I broke away from my own group and moved east as fast as the corridor would allow me, my mind already building the report I would have to file, already building the argument I would need to make when someone above me asked why a member of my unit had directly disobeyed a command that had come from a level far above mine. I found him in a narrow storage room that smelled of dust and old oil. 2 enemy soldiers sat against the far wall, hands bound in front of them, one pressing a strip of cloth against a wound in his own shoulder that Marcus had clearly helped him apply. Neither of them was resisting. Neither of them looked like they had any fight left at all. Marcus stood near the doorway, rifle lowered but ready, watching the corridor behind him rather than the 2 men he had just disarmed. I do not know exactly what I expected to say to him in that moment. I know what came out was sharper than I intended. I asked him, in a voice that echoed off the narrow walls, whether he understood the order he had been given that morning. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and there was no fear in his expression at all, only something that looked almost like patience, the kind you might show towards someone asking a question you had already answered many times before in your own mind. He said that he understood it completely, and that he had followed it, exactly as it was given. I told him that men bound and breathing against a wall were not what no mercy meant where I came from. He said that where he came from, it meant something different, and that if I gave him a moment once the compound was fully secured, he would explain it to me plainly, soldier to sergeant, without either of us needing to raise our voices about it. I did not have time to answer him, because at that exact second, the compound's 2nd floor lit up with fresh gunfire, and every question I had was pushed aside by the much older, much simpler question of whether my soldiers were about to walk into an ambush that none of us had accounted for. We moved. Whatever I thought about Marcus Reyes and his strange, quiet defiance of the order I had given would have to wait. The stronghold was not as empty as our reports suggested, and somewhere above us, in a part of the compound we had not yet cleared, more enemy fighters were waiting, and they had just made it very clear that they knew exactly where we were standing. I signaled my soldiers to fall back into cover, my mind racing through every possible reason the 2nd floor had gone quiet for so long, only to erupt now, all at once, in a single coordinated burst of fire that felt far too organized to be a lucky guess. Marcus was already moving toward the stairwell before I gave a single order, and for the first time that day, I found myself following his lead instead of the other way around, because whatever pattern he had been solving in his mind since the moment we breached that outer wall, I was beginning to understand that I did not yet have all the pieces of it myself. The compound had one more secret to give up before the day was finished, and I had a feeling that whatever waited for us upstairs would only make the question of what Marcus Reyes had done in that storage room feel a great deal smaller by comparison. The stairwell was narrow enough that only one soldier could move through it at a time, which meant whoever went first would be the one absorbing the first shot, if the ambush above was as organized as it sounded. Marcus took that position without waiting for me to assign it, and I found myself letting him, some instinct telling me that arguing about rank in that stairwell would cost us more time than it was worth. He moved up 2 steps at a time, low and fast, and I followed close behind him with 2 more soldiers pressed against my back. The gunfire above had changed rhythm, no longer the wild burst we had heard from the storage room, but something steadier, more deliberate, the kind of fire pattern trained soldiers use when they are trying to pin a target down, rather than simply spray a room. At the top of the stairwell, Marcus stopped so suddenly that I nearly walked into him. He held up one hand, palm flat, the signal every soldier in the coalition forces understood, regardless of what world they were born on. Wait. I listened, and beneath the gunfire, I heard something else. Voices. Not the panicked shouting of fighters caught by surprise, but calm, low instructions being passed between at least 3 different positions. This was not a group of stragglers making a last stand. This was a command post. Marcus turned his head just enough to look back at me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he told me that if this really was a coordinated command position, then whoever was leading it would already know exactly how many of us had entered the building, because someone inside had been watching our approach through a window we had not accounted for. He said the only way to end it cleanly, without losing soldiers on our side, was to draw their fire toward a single point, and use the noise of that exchange to move around their flank. I asked him how he knew this was even possible in a floor plan neither of us had seen before that morning. He said he did not know it for certain. He said it was a guess, built from the sound of their voices and the angle of the fire, and that guesses were sometimes all a soldier had time to build a plan around. He said this so plainly, so without any doubt weighing down his voice, that I found myself agreeing to it before I had fully thought it through myself. I sent 2 of my soldiers toward the sound of the loudest voice, giving them just enough cover fire to make their approach look like the main thrust of our advance. Marcus and I moved the opposite direction, along a hallway lined with broken furniture and old supply crates, toward what he believed was the flank of their position. The hallway ended in a room that had clearly once been used for meetings, a long table still standing in its center, chairs overturned around it. 3 enemy fighters stood near the far window, rifles aimed toward the noise our 2 soldiers were making down the corridor, exactly as Marcus had predicted. None of them had turned to check the direction we had come from. This was the moment, I understood later, that would matter more than anything else that happened that day. Because in the space of those next few seconds, I expected Marcus to end the threat the same way any soldier trained under the old doctrine would end it, quickly and completely, before any of those 3 fighters had a chance to turn around and fire back. Instead, he called out to them in their own language, a handful of words I recognized as a formal surrender phrase used across several regional dialects, the kind of phrase taught in basic coalition training, but rarely used in the field because most soldiers assumed it would never work. 2 of the 3 fighters turned immediately, weapons still raised, and for one terrible moment I thought we had made a mistake that would cost us both our lives. Then the 3rd fighter, an older man with gray showing at his temples, said something sharp to the other 2 in their own tongue, and slowly, all 3 of them lowered their weapons to the floor. I do not know what he said to them. I have thought about it many times since, and I still do not know. But whatever it was, it worked, and within a minute, all 3 of them were on their knees, with their hands laced behind their heads, and the fighting on that floor had stopped entirely. The report I filed that night did not go well for either of us. Command reviewed the footage from our helmet cameras within hours, and by the following morning, I was called before a senior officer named Daniel Ashworth, a man known across the Legion for his strict interpretation of every order handed down from above. He did not raise his voice during our meeting, which somehow made the conversation worse than if he had shouted at me the entire time. He asked me plainly whether I understood the order I had been given before the assault began. I told him I did. He asked me why, then, 5 enemy combatants had survived the operation when the order explicitly called for none to remain. I told him that the operation had succeeded, that no soldiers under my command had been lost, and that the compound had been fully secured, within the time frame expected of us. He said that was not the question he had asked me. I found myself, in that small gray office, defending a decision I had not made myself, made instead by a human cadet I had known for only 6 weeks. I told Ashworth that the surviving combatants had been the ones providing useful information about the wider network of raiders operating in the region, that our intelligence teams had already begun extracting details about supply routes and hidden weapons caches from them within hours of their capture. I told him this because it was true, and because it was the only argument I had that might satisfy a man like him. It worked, for the moment. Ashworth was not a man who cared much for mercy as an idea, but he cared very much for results, and the intelligence gathered from those 5 prisoners turned out to be worth more than the stronghold itself had been. He dismissed me with a warning that the next deviation from a direct order would not be treated so lightly, and I left his office feeling something I had not expected to feel. Relief, yes, but also a strange, low-burning curiosity about the soldier who had somehow been right about all of it. I found Marcus later that evening, sitting alone near the edge of our camp, cleaning his rifle by lamplight while the rest of the company ate their evening meal inside the mess tent. I sat down across from him without asking permission, which was not something I usually did with soldiers under my command, but something about the day had already broken the usual shape of things between us. I asked him to explain it to me properly this time, slowly, the way you might explain something to someone who genuinely wanted to understand, rather than someone looking for a reason to punish you. He set down the rifle and thought about it for a moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than I had heard it before, without any of the sharpness from our exchange in the storage room that morning. He said that where he came from, the phrase "no mercy" was not really about the enemy standing in front of you at all. It was about the war itself, about denying that war anything it could use to keep itself alive. He said that a soldier left wounded and screaming, left to die slowly, over hours or days while his friends listened from a distance, was not a victory. It was a seed. It grew into hatred, and hatred grew into new fighters, and new fighters grew into wars that never actually ended, only paused long enough to gather strength again. He said that surrender taken cleanly, prisoners treated without cruelty, wounds tended rather than ignored, denied the enemy that seed entirely. A man treated fairly after his surrender had no story of suffering to carry home to his children. He had no reason to raise the next generation on stories of what had been done to him. The war, in his mind, ended more completely that way than it ever could, through fire and ruin. He said something else that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said that where he came from, mercy withheld was often mistaken for strength, but in practice, it was usually just fear, wearing a harder mask. Fear that if you did not destroy your enemy completely, he might one day return to destroy you instead. He said that real strength, the kind that actually won wars instead of simply prolonging them, came from being certain enough of your own position that you did not need to erase every trace of the person standing against you. I did not have an answer for him that night. I told him I would think about it, and I meant it, though I did not yet know how much thinking it would actually require, or how differently I would see my own long career by the time I finished doing so. What I did not tell him that evening, because I did not yet know it myself, was that Ashworth had already begun asking questions of his own about the human cadet who had defied a direct order and somehow turned the outcome into the most valuable intelligence haul the Legion had seen in months. Questions that would not stay quiet for long, and that would soon reach far higher up the chain of command than either of us expected. The summons came 8 days later, delivered by a young runner who looked far too nervous to be carrying a routine message. I was to report to the regional command post with Cadet Reyes at first light, appearing before a review panel that included officers I had only ever seen from a distance during formal ceremonies. I read the message twice before I fully understood what it meant. This was no longer a private disagreement between a sergeant and one of his soldiers. It had become something the entire Legion leadership wanted to examine. I told Marcus that night, expecting some flicker of concern to cross his face, some sign that the weight of what was coming had finally reached him. Instead, he simply nodded, the same way he had nodded when I first gave the order that started all of this, and said that he had known this conversation would happen eventually, and that he would rather have it out in the open than continue working quietly around an order he did not believe in. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the 5 prisoners we had taken, about the intelligence they had given up, about the strange calm on Marcus's face when he called out that surrender phrase to soldiers who could easily have killed him for the attempt. I kept thinking, too, about my own long career, about the 11 times I had given that same order before him, and never once questioned what it truly meant. The command post sat at the top of a hill, overlooking the valley where our stronghold assault had taken place, and from its windows you could still see the scarred outline of the compound in the distance, a dark shape against the green hills surrounding it. The review room itself was smaller than I expected, a long table with 5 officers seated behind it, Ashworth among them, along with a woman I did not recognize wearing the insignia of the Joint Coalition Liaison Office. Her name, I would learn shortly after we entered, was Grace Holloway, and she had been assigned to oversee the human integration program across 3 separate legions. She was the only one in that room who looked at Marcus with something other than suspicion when we walked in, and I found myself grateful for that small detail, even before the questioning began. Ashworth opened the proceedings by reading the original order aloud, the same words I had spoken to my company 8 days earlier, and then listing, one by one, the moments during the assault where Marcus had visibly departed from what those words demanded. He spoke without any real anger in his voice, which somehow made his words land harder than shouting would have. He was building a case, methodically, the way a soldier builds a wall, one stone placed carefully after another. When he finished, he turned to Marcus directly and asked him to explain, in his own words, why a cadet under Coalition command believed he had the authority to reinterpret an order handed down from Legion leadership. Marcus did not answer immediately. He took a moment, the same unhurried pause I had come to recognize from him, and then spoke in a voice steady enough that it carried to every corner of that small room, without him needing to raise it. He said that he had not reinterpreted the order. He said he had followed it exactly as it was given, using the meaning that phrase carried in every context he had ever known it to be used. He said that if the Legion wished for a different outcome in the future, the order itself would need to be worded differently, because as it stood, the words simply did not mean what the officers in that room assumed they meant. One of the other officers, an older man whose name I never learned, asked him sharply whether he believed his own interpretation outweighed the intentions of the Legion command structure that had issued the order in the first place. Marcus answered that intentions mattered less than outcomes in his experience, and that the outcome of the assault had been a fully secured compound, 0 casualties among Coalition forces, and the most useful intelligence haul the region had produced in recent memory. He said he was not asking anyone in that room to agree with where he came from, or how his people fought their wars. He was simply asking them to look honestly at what had actually happened, rather than at what the words on a page had been assumed to mean. Grace Holloway spoke for the first time then, and her voice carried a different weight than the others, calmer, more measured, the voice of someone used to translating between very different ways of seeing the same problem. She said that this exact confusion had come up in 3 other legions since the integration program began, and that in every case, human soldiers had produced results that, by any practical measure, outperformed the doctrine they had technically departed from. She suggested, carefully, that perhaps the panel was not truly examining a discipline problem at all, but a difference in doctrine that deserved study rather than punishment. Ashworth was not satisfied with that answer, and I understood why. He had built his entire career on the certainty that orders meant exactly what they said, that soldiers who reinterpreted them, however successfully, undermined the trust an entire legion depended on. He said that today's success did not guarantee tomorrow's, and that a compound cleared without total elimination of enemy fighters left open the possibility that those same fighters, or others trained by them, would return to cause harm later. It was here that I finally spoke, though I had not planned to say anything at all when we walked into that room. I told the panel that I had given the order 11 times before this assault, always in the old way, always with the outcome the Legion expected. And in at least 4 of those 11 cases, I said, the settlements we destroyed completely had produced new resistance movements within a single season, made up of the sons and brothers of the very fighters we had eliminated. I said that I had never before connected those 2 facts, the harshness of our methods and the persistence of the resistance we faced afterward, until I watched a very different method produce a very different result in the space of a single morning. The room went quiet after that. Ashworth studied me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing something behind his eyes, some calculation that had nothing to do with rank or procedure, and everything to do with whether the numbers I had just given him were true. He asked me to provide those 4 settlements by name and date, which I did from memory, because a sergeant remembers the missions that go wrong far longer than the ones that go smoothly. He wrote them down himself, without asking an aide to do it for him, and I understood in that moment that whatever else came from this hearing, I had at least given him something worth investigating on its own merits. The panel adjourned without reaching a decision that day, which Grace Holloway told us afterward, quietly, in the hallway outside the review room, was actually a good sign. She said that if they had wanted to end Marcus's posting immediately, they would have done so on the spot, rather than taking time to consider it further. She told us to return to our unit and continue our duties as normal while the review continued, and she promised to advocate, within the limits of her position, for a fuller study of what she called the outcome-based doctrine before any final judgment was made. We returned to our company that evening, carrying more questions than answers, and I found myself, for the first time in a long career, genuinely uncertain about what the coming weeks would bring. Uncertain was not a feeling I had much practice with, and I did not enjoy it, but there was something underneath the discomfort that felt almost like hope, a small, stubborn thing I had not expected to find at the end of such a difficult day. That hope was tested sooner than I expected. 3 nights later, our company received word that a settlement 2 provinces to the east, one that had surrendered to a different legion under the old doctrine only weeks earlier, had produced a new wave of armed resistance almost overnight. The report came through our comm channels with grim detail. Soldiers from that legion had followed the traditional order to its fullest extent, and the survivors, the families of those who had not survived at all, had organized themselves within a single month into a force large enough to ambush a supply convoy and kill 6 coalition soldiers in the process. I read that report twice, then handed it to Marcus without saying anything. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable, and when he finally looked up at me, there was no satisfaction in his eyes at having been proven right. There was only a tired kind of sadness, the look of a man who had hoped very much that this particular pattern would not repeat itself so quickly, so close to home. He said quietly that this was exactly what he had been trying to explain in the review room, that the old doctrine did not fail because it lacked force, but because force alone never actually ended anything. It only delayed the ending, and made the delay far more costly when it finally arrived. I asked him what he thought should be done now, about that settlement, about the resistance already forming there. He said that the damage from the first response could not be entirely undone, but that it was not too late to change how the coalition responded to what came next. He suggested that instead of another purely destructive operation, the response should focus on separating the small, hardened core of fighters from the much larger number of frightened, grieving people who had joined them out of desperation, rather than conviction. He said that most resistance movements, in his experience, were smaller than they appeared from the outside, propped up by fear and grief more than by actual numbers, and that finding a way to address the fear and grief directly often did more to end a conflict than any amount of additional force ever could. I brought this suggestion to Ashworth the following morning, expecting him to dismiss it outright, given everything that had happened over the previous week. Instead, he listened in silence for longer than I expected, and when I finished speaking, he asked a single question that told me his own thinking had already begun to shift, in ways he had not yet admitted openly. He asked whether Marcus would be willing to advise the operation directly, rather than simply offering suggestions from a distance. I did not answer for him. I told Ashworth he would need to ask Marcus that question himself. When Ashworth did ask, later that same day, in a conversation I was permitted to witness but not to interrupt, Marcus agreed without hesitation. He said only that he wanted it understood clearly, before anything else was decided, that his approach was not born from weakness or from any unwillingness to fight. He said that ending a war cleanly and completely required just as much discipline, just as much precision, as fighting it savagely, and that anyone who mistook his methods for softness had simply never watched them carried out under real pressure. Ashworth studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some old certainty giving way, slowly and reluctantly, to a new kind of respect. He said that he still did not fully understand the human way of thinking, and that he suspected he never fully would. But he said that he had spent 30 years building his career on results, and that for the first time in a very long time, he was willing to set aside what he thought he knew in favor of what the evidence in front of him was actually showing. We left that meeting with an assignment that none of us had expected only a week earlier. Marcus would join the operation being planned for the settlement to the east, not as a cadet under review, but as an advisor whose methods had, for the moment at least, earned a place at the table alongside officers who had spent their entire lives believing in something very different. I did not know yet how difficult that operation would prove to be, or how close it would come to unraveling everything Marcus had worked to demonstrate over the previous 8 days. But I knew, walking away from that meeting in the fading evening light, that whatever came next would test his doctrine, in a way our first assault never had, against an enemy already shaped by grief and anger, rather than simple opportunity, and that the outcome of that test would decide far more than just his own future within the Legion. We reached the outskirts of the eastern settlement 3 days later, traveling with a smaller force than usual, a decision Marcus had pushed for from the start. He argued that a large, visible military presence would only confirm every fear the settlement's survivors already carried, making them harder to reach rather than easier. Ashworth had agreed reluctantly, and so we approached with a single company rather than the full battalion that had been proposed at first. The settlement itself looked nothing like the stronghold we had cleared weeks earlier. There were no defensive walls here, no fortified positions built for war. This was simply a town that had been unlucky enough to be caught between two forces it never asked to be part of, its buildings scarred from the earlier assault, its streets quieter than any settlement has a right to be. I saw children watching us from doorways, with expressions far older than their faces should have carried, and I understood, in a way I had not fully understood before, exactly what Marcus meant about seeds and what they grow into. Our scouts confirmed within hours that the resistance forming here was smaller than the initial report suggested, no more than 30 armed fighters organized around a handful of experienced leaders, hidden among a much larger population of frightened, grieving civilians who wanted nothing more than for the fighting to simply stop. This matched exactly what Marcus had predicted, and I watched him receive that confirmation, with no visible satisfaction at all, only a quiet, focused determination to get the details right before anyone made another mistake. The plan he proposed was unlike anything I had been part of before. Rather than moving directly against the armed fighters, he suggested establishing contact with the settlement's remaining civilian leadership first, offering medical support, food, and a clear channel for communication before any show of force was made at all. He argued that the fighters drew their strength from the fear and support of the wider population, and that removing that support quietly would do more damage to their position than any direct assault ever could. Ashworth was uneasy with this approach from the beginning, and I understood his hesitation. It required patience that ran against everything our training had taught us, patience that felt, at times, dangerously close to weakness in a situation where lives were clearly still at risk. But he had given his word to let Marcus lead this operation, and to his credit, he held to that word even when every instinct in him must have been pulling in a different direction. The first 2 days passed slowly, tensely, with our medical teams moving carefully through the settlement under Marcus's direct supervision, treating wounds left over from the earlier assault, distributing supplies that had been withheld during the fighting. I watched the settlement's residents approach our soldiers with visible suspicion at first, flinching at every sudden movement, expecting cruelty even as we offered them help. Slowly, over those 2 days, something in that suspicion began to shift, not disappearing entirely, but softening into something closer to cautious trust. On the third day, everything nearly fell apart. A patrol on the settlement's northern edge came under sudden fire from a small group of resistance fighters positioned in the ruins of a burned granary, catching 2 of our soldiers in the open before they could reach cover. I heard the report come through my comm unit while I was standing beside Marcus near the settlement's central well, and I watched his expression change instantly, from calm focus to something sharper, more urgent, though still controlled. We moved toward the northern edge together, along with a squad of soldiers who had been resting nearby, and arrived to find our 2 wounded soldiers pulled behind a low stone wall by the rest of their patrol, both alive but bleeding heavily enough that every second mattered. The fighters in the granary continued firing sporadically, their position well chosen, forcing our people to stay pinned down rather than risk crossing the open ground between the wall and the ruined building. This was the moment, I understood immediately, where everything Marcus had built over the previous 2 days could be undone in an instant. If our response now returned to the old doctrine, if we answered this ambush with the same overwhelming force that had shaped this settlement's grief in the first place, every ounce of trust so carefully built would collapse, and the resistance forming here would only grow stronger, fed by fresh grievance layered on top of the old. Marcus did not hesitate, but he also did not rush. He called out toward the granary, in the settlement's own language, the same clear, steady voice I remembered from the storage room weeks earlier, telling whoever was inside that our medical teams had been treating their families for 2 days, that we had no wish to destroy what remained of their town, and that continued fighting now would only bring the exact kind of destruction everyone in that settlement had been dreading since the first assault ever reached them. The fighters inside did not answer immediately, and for a long, tense moment I genuinely believed the situation would end badly despite everything he had said. Then, slowly, the firing from the granary stopped, and a single voice called back, asking whether the wounded soldiers behind our wall would receive the same treatment we had been giving the settlement's own people over the previous 2 days. Marcus answered without a moment's hesitation that they would, and that the same offer extended to anyone inside that granary, willing to lay down their weapon, regardless of what they had done in the previous hour. He said this loudly enough that every soldier and every fighter within earshot could hear it clearly, making it impossible for anyone to later claim the offer had been anything other than exactly what it sounded like. One by one, over the following 10 minutes, 7 fighters emerged from the granary with their hands raised, weapons left behind on the ground inside. I recognized among them one of the older leaders our scouts had identified days earlier, a man whose face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a war he no longer fully believed could be won, but did not know how to stop fighting either. Our medical team treated our 2 wounded soldiers immediately, and to my genuine surprise, Marcus insisted the same team also examine the surrendering fighters for injuries, several of whom had wounds from the earlier assault on the settlement that had never properly healed. I watched him kneel beside the older fighter, checking a bandage that had clearly been applied days earlier by someone without proper training, and I understood, watching that quiet, unremarkable moment, exactly what he had meant weeks earlier about ending a war completely, rather than simply pausing it. The remaining resistance fighters, word reached us later that same evening, dissolved almost entirely within another 2 days, the core group having lost both its strongest leader and the wider population's tolerance for continued fighting, once it became clear that surrender would not mean punishment. By the end of that week, the settlement that had nearly produced a second wave of violence against our forces had instead become something closer to a fragile, cautious peace, one built not on the absence of all danger, but on the careful, deliberate removal of the reasons that danger had grown there in the first place. Ashworth arrived to inspect the settlement personally 6 days after the ambush at the granary, and I watched him walk its streets with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between disbelief and grudging admiration. He asked Marcus directly, in front of several other officers, how he had known the fighters in that granary would respond to an offer of surrender, rather than simply fighting until they were destroyed. Marcus answered honestly that he had not known for certain, only that the alternative, responding with overwhelming force, guaranteed a worse outcome, regardless of what happened next. He said that certainty was rarely available in moments like that one, and that the discipline required was not knowing exactly how things would turn out, but choosing the response most likely to end the conflict, rather than extend it, even when that response felt, in the moment, far more dangerous than the alternative. Ashworth did not have an immediate answer for that, and I found myself, watching the 2 of them standing together in that quiet, recovering settlement, thinking back to the 11 times I had given the old order over the course of my own long career, and wondering how many of those situations might have ended differently if someone had simply been willing to ask the same question Marcus had just answered so plainly. That evening, back at our camp on the outskirts of the settlement, Grace Holloway arrived unexpectedly, having traveled from the regional command post to observe the operation's final results firsthand. She told us, once she had reviewed the full report from the previous week, that the review panel back at command had reached a decision regarding Marcus's earlier conduct, one that would be delivered formally within a matter of days. She would not tell us what that decision was that evening, only that it would be delivered in person, by officers senior enough that the outcome would carry weight across the entire Legion, rather than remaining a quiet local matter settled between a sergeant and his cadet. I asked her, as directly as I dared, whether she believed the decision would go in Marcus's favor. She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since the review room weeks earlier, and said only that results were difficult to argue with, once enough of them had accumulated in the same direction. She left us with that answer, and with the settlement finally quiet behind us for the first time in weeks, I found myself, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, allowing myself something close to real hope about what the coming days might bring, both for Marcus and for the doctrine he had fought so quietly and so persistently to defend. That hope nearly shattered before it had a chance to take root. 4 days after Grace Holloway's visit, our company received urgent orders to move north, toward a border outpost that had gone silent overnight, after reporting an unusually large enemy force massing nearby. This was not a settlement full of frightened civilians and a handful of grieving fighters. Reports described a trained, organized force, larger than anything we had faced since the original stronghold assault, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested a level of planning far beyond what local resistance groups typically managed on their own. Ashworth briefed us personally before we departed, his voice carrying an urgency I had not heard from him before. He said that intelligence suggested this force had been assembled deliberately, drawing together fighters from several settlements across the region, possibly organized by someone with knowledge of how the coalition forces operated. He looked directly at Marcus when he said this last part, and I understood immediately what he was suggesting, though he did not say it outright. Someone out there had learned from what had happened at the Eastern Settlement, and had decided that a larger, better coordinated force might succeed where smaller resistance groups had failed. We arrived at the border outpost just before dawn, finding it already under attack, the small garrison stationed there fighting desperately to hold a perimeter that had clearly been breached in at least 2 places. I had never seen an operation of this size and speed, organized by anyone other than a full coalition legion, and the sight of it, disciplined enemy fighters moving in coordinated waves, rather than the scattered, desperate assaults we usually faced, sent a cold understanding through me that this day would be unlike any that came before it. Marcus moved immediately to assess the perimeter breaches, and I followed close behind him, both of us working to understand the shape of the attack before deciding how best to respond. What we found troubled me more than the attack itself. The enemy fighters were not simply overwhelming the garrison through numbers. They were deliberately targeting the outpost's medical station first, a detail that made no tactical sense unless their goal was something other than simple destruction. Marcus reached the same conclusion I did, though he voiced it before I had fully worked it through myself. He said quietly that whoever had organized this attack understood exactly what our new approach depended on: the medical support, the offers of surrender, the careful handling of civilians and wounded fighters alike. By destroying the outpost's ability to provide any of that, they were removing the very tools that had made our approach at the Eastern Settlement succeed in the first place, forcing us back into a purely destructive response whether we wanted one or not. I asked him what that meant, for how we should respond now, given that the doctrine he had spent weeks defending seemed to depend on tools that had just been deliberately stripped away from us. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fighting unfold along the outpost's northern wall, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, the weight of someone recalculating everything he believed, under pressure far greater than anything he had faced up to that point. He said that the doctrine itself had never depended only on medical stations or supplies. It depended on making the cost of continued fighting clear enough, and the path toward ending it clear enough, that most people chose the second option once given a real choice. He said that even here, even now, that same principle could still apply, though it would require a different kind of precision than anything we had used before, because there would be no time now for the slow, patient approach that had worked at the settlement days earlier. We moved together toward the eastern breach, where the fighting was heaviest, and I watched Marcus work in a way I had not seen from him before. Not the calm, deliberate precision of the storage room weeks earlier, but something faster, sharper, adapted to the reality that this enemy understood our methods, and had come prepared specifically to defeat them. He called out toward the advancing fighters, as he had at the granary, but this time, the response was immediate gunfire rather than hesitation, confirming what Ashworth had suspected. These fighters had been briefed, deliberately, to ignore any offer of surrender we made. For the first time since I had known him, I watched Marcus fight without any attempt to draw fighters away from the conflict through words alone. He fought precisely, efficiently, ending threats as they appeared without hesitation, but even in the speed of that fighting, I noticed something I had not expected. He was still, wherever possible, aiming to disable rather than to destroy completely, still creating small pockets where fighters who chose to disengage were allowed to do so, rather than being pursued without mercy, simply because pursuit was available to him. It was not the slow, patient doctrine from the Eastern Settlement. It was something adapted to the moment, faster and harder, but still carrying the same underlying principle, even under conditions designed specifically to strip that principle away. I understood, watching him move through that breach, that this was the true test of everything he had tried to teach me over the previous weeks. Not whether his methods worked in ideal conditions, but whether they held together at all when an enemy deliberately tried to break them. The fighting at the eastern breach lasted nearly 20 minutes before the attacking force began to fall back, their coordinated assault losing cohesion once it became clear that the garrison, reinforced now by our arriving company, would not simply collapse the way their planning had assumed. I saw the enemy commander, a tall figure directing fighters from a position near the outer wall, finally signal a general withdrawal once the cost of continuing became too high to justify whatever gain they had hoped this attack would achieve. Marcus was wounded during those final minutes, a shot that caught his shoulder as he moved to pull a fallen garrison soldier back from an exposed position near the wall. I saw him stumble, saw the sudden dark stain spreading across his uniform, and felt something close to panic rise in me that I did not expect to feel for a soldier I had known for such a short time. I reached him within seconds, pulling him back behind cover myself, applying pressure to the wound, while our own medical team fought their way through the chaos to reach us. He was conscious the entire time, his breathing labored but steady, and even in that moment, with blood soaking through the cloth I pressed against his shoulder, he managed something close to a tired, wry smile. He said that this, at least, was one part of the doctrine he had never quite figured out how to avoid entirely, the part where the person trying to end a fight, without unnecessary destruction, sometimes ended up paying a personal cost that the fight itself never fully repaid. I told him to save his strength rather than his jokes, and he laughed quietly despite the pain, a sound I had not heard from him before in all the weeks I had known him. The medical team reached us minutes later, and I stayed beside him as they worked, watching the same careful, precise attention being given to his wound that he had insisted be given to enemy fighters weeks earlier at that first stronghold. There was something almost fitting about that, though I did not fully understand why until much later, lying awake that night in the outpost's makeshift barracks, thinking back over everything that had happened since the morning I first gave that order 11 times repeated and once transformed. Marcus recovered over the following weeks, the wound serious enough to keep him from active duty, but not serious enough to threaten his life, and during that recovery, the formal decision from the review panel finally arrived, delivered in person by an officer, senior enough that his presence alone told us the outcome, before he spoke a single word. The panel had reviewed every report from the Eastern Settlement operation, along with the events at the border outpost, and had concluded that the outcome-based doctrine Marcus had introduced would be formally incorporated into Legion training going forward, not as a replacement for existing methods entirely, but as an approach commanders could choose to apply when circumstances allowed for it. It was not the sweeping victory some might have imagined for a story like this one. There was no formal apology from Ashworth, no dramatic reversal of everything the Legion had believed before. But there was, in the months that followed, a slow and steady shift I watched happen across several other companies within our Legion. Sergeants, who had once given the old order without a second thought, now pausing, at least for a moment, to consider whether a different response might serve them better. I gave the order myself only 4 more times over the following years, and each time I gave it, I made certain the soldiers receiving it understood exactly what I meant by it, the meaning Marcus had taught me, rather than the meaning I had carried unquestioned for most of my career. No mercy for the war itself, I told them, not for the man standing in front of you with his hands already raised. Marcus eventually rotated home, as all human cadets eventually did, back to whatever world had raised soldiers capable of looking at total destruction and calling it the weaker choice rather than the stronger one. I did not see him again after that, though word reached me occasionally through Grace Holloway, who continued corresponding with several of us long after her own posting to our region ended. He had, apparently, gone on to train other cadets in the very doctrine he had first demonstrated in that dusty storage room, teaching them the same patient, precise discipline that had ended a war more completely than any amount of fire ever could. I think of him still, sometimes, standing in that stairwell all those years ago, calling out words of surrender to men who could easily have killed him for the attempt. And I think of the old man, with gray at his temples, who chose, in that single terrifying moment, to lower his weapon rather than raise it. I think of the settlement that became a fragile, cautious peace instead of a second generation of grief. I think of everything that changed in me over those few short weeks, not because someone told me the old way was wrong, but because someone showed me, patiently and repeatedly, exactly what the words I had spoken so easily for so long could actually mean, if I was only willing to listen. I gave that order 11 times before him, and it meant one thing every single time. I have given it only a handful of times since, and it has meant something entirely different each time I have spoken it, something I carry with me still, long after the war that brought Marcus Reyes into my company finally, quietly, completely came to its end.